And I believe we're technically in verse 8, but we'll start in verse 1 just to get a little quick recap. So Galatians 4. It says this in verse 1. Let's recap real fast. I mean that the heir as long as he is a child is no different from a slave, though he is the owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. So going through verses 1 through 7, it goes into comparing, I guess a quick recap for our visitors. So Paul is writing the letter to the Galatian churches because they are being faced with Judaizers, right, that are coming and trying to pervert the gospel that Paul has shared with them. So Paul has brought them truth about Jesus, and then the Judaizers are trying to go back to the Old Testament and bring back in circumcision, right? So Paul is saying you just need Jesus, and then the Judaizers are saying you need Jesus plus circumcision, right? Plus these old things of the law. And so Paul is telling them, well, you're getting back underneath a curse, right? You're being put back into a form of slavery because you're going to the things of the old, right? So Paul is preaching a gospel that saves and restores, while the Judaizers are teaching a gospel, not that there is more than one, but they're teaching a message that is actually putting a burden onto people because it's forcing them to go back to the old law. And what do we know about the old law? If you can't follow all of it, what have you not done? You're not in good shape, are you? Right? You have to follow every single bit of it. Is anybody good at following like 1,600 rules? No, says I, right? I would get lost after probably just 25 or 30 trying to remember all of them, right? So you had to follow everything. So here comes Jesus, and he takes that burden away and gives us this chance of redemption, right? And so then in verse 2 it says, but he is under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. Speaking of the slave, right? So who is our guardian? And what's another word for guardian? Some of your all's translations may say something different.
Teacher, tutor.
Teacher and tutor, right? So who is our tutor? Who is our guardian in that time? What was it? The law, right? It's the Old Testament, right? So it was the old law was our tutor until the date set by the Father. The date set by the Father was right when Jesus came back and then everything that took place there, right? So it says, in the same way you were children, you were enslaved to the elementary principles, which we're going to talk about here in just a second, of the world. So then when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, who was born of a woman under the law, to redeem those who were under the law. So what did Jesus become in order to save us according to, I want to say it's in Galatians 3. What is it if we are full of sin, what are we under? Starts with the C. Curse, right? So what did Jesus become when he was hung on a cross? According to what the old saying would have been. He would have become a curse, right? Because cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree, right? Jesus was hung on a tree. So he would have became a curse in order to save us from what? From our curse, right? Which is interesting how that works. So he redeems us under the law that so we might receive adoption as sons, which I think is interesting. There's a lot of sweet things that you could see in life, but probably some of the sweetest ones that you could see are some of those videos where two individuals or something like that, or maybe it's one person, is adopting a child that doesn't have a home anymore, right? They've had a rough upbringing. They've just been displaced. They don't have any stability. They're put into foster care, whatever it might be, right? And then someone says, you know what? I'm going to adopt them. I'm going to take care of them, right? That's what Jesus does, right? We're roaming this earth with all these things around us. And then here comes Jesus. Hey, y'all. Then here comes Jesus, adopts us as sons, right? As children of him to take care of us. So then our hearts are crying out because we are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then a heir through God, right? And so what was the Jewish thought, I guess, back in this time? You had to be what in order to be, you had to be a Jew, right? You had to be a son of Abraham, right? You had to be a whole part of that whole family. And what Paul is teaching back in this, he said, yeah, well, that came 400 plus years ago, right? And so if you're saying that you have to do what Abraham did, the law wasn't even a thing when Abraham was there. That came 400 years afterwards, right? 430 years to be exact. That's Galatians 3:17. So it came 430 years afterwards. So Paul is basically calling them out for their hypocrisy. And the other thing that Paul does, which if I was a Jew, I would hate to debate Paul, because Paul would have had greater teaching than you most likely. And Paul also knew all of that information and then still converted to Christianity, right, after he was met with Jesus. So here comes Judaizers trying to teach Paul something that Paul already knows. Paul knows exactly what they're about to say, and he calls them out because he knows the law better than they do. So going into verse 8, let's read 8 through 20. This will be our main study for this morning. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain. Brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. You knew it was because of a bodily element that I preached the gospel to you at first. And though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. What then has become of your blessedness? For I testify to you that, if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me. Have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth? They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out, that you may make much of them. It is always good to be made much of for a good purpose, and not only when I am present with you, my little children. For who I am again in anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. I wish I could be present with you now and change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. And by the way, for our visitors, this is a Q&A. And so whenever there's a Q, you can answer A into the microphone. So please interrupt me, especially if you have good thoughts. I prefer it that way. I don't like talking the whole time. That just gets boring. So, formerly when you did not know God. So the first part is, what were we when we did not know God? And you can see it in the end of it. You were enslaved to those by nature that are not God's, right? So when we didn't know God, what were we enslaved to? Ourselves, right? The world, everything in it, right? Things that by nature are not God's, right? You can see it in the world today. People idolize a lot of things. And it's always something that's temporary. It's always something it's not going with you when you leave, right? They could idolize certain positions. They could idolize, you see it a lot in sports, they idolize certain people and they put them on a pedestal. And then no matter what that person does, they're still a good person. It's like, well, you only think that because they're on your team and you need them to be good, right? That doesn't mean what they're doing is right, okay? So we idolize things, they're not God's, right? So when we did not know God, we were enslaved to those, right? But now that you have come to know God, or rather be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world? So what are some of the things that have been worshipped in the past, Old Testament-wise, that these Jews have worshipped? Graven images. What was one thing that Aaron made? A golden calf. Here it comes. I don't know what happened. They threw this stuff into a fire. It came out, and then boom, here's a golden calf, right? So they had done this before, right? So now here comes Paul, right? And you have to think that the non-Jews also worshipped idols, right? Think about the city of Ephesus, right? Why did so many people hate the teaching of Christianity in the city of Ephesus?
Because they made their living making idols.
Yeah, they literally made their living, they made their money by making idols. So if you teach something that teaches against idols, now you're taking away my livelihood. You're taking away my money, right? Which is why they were so against it. So here Paul is saying, so you were enslaved to these things that are not God's, but you've come to know God, or rather be known by God. How then are you going to turn back away from that? How have you been introduced to something so marvelous, so wonderful that can save you, and then in the next breath you can turn back around and go back to something that puts you into bondage, into something that doesn't save you, into something that has no long-term benefit for you because you're not in the blood of Christ, right? How can you do that? Why is it weak? Why is what they're turning back to weak? What are they turning back to? Sin. Idolatry. What else? What are the Judaizers trying to get them to turn back to?
The law.
The old law. Why is the old law weak? There you go. Why is it worthless? Why is it worthless? It says weak and worthless. So it's weak because you don't get forgiveness of sin. Why is it also worthless? Because you don't get forgiveness of sin, right? That's why. What is not weak? The blood of Christ, right? What is not worthless, right? The blood of Christ, right? The blood of Christ is extremely strong because it can do what? It can cover up everything back there. On Wednesday nights, we're studying Philippians, and we just finished Philippians 4, where it talks about straining forward, right? Paul says, I'm not looking in the rearview mirror because I'm looking forward to what ahead, because Christ has taken care of all that stuff behind. I don't have to look at it behind me anymore because Christ's blood has taken care of that, and so I can now look forward to what is ahead, right? And so how can you turn back to something that is weak because it doesn't give you forgiveness of sins? How can you turn back to something that is worthless because it doesn't give you forgiveness of sins? Because they're elementary principles of the world. Why would people turn back to that? Because they did, and you can see it in the world today. Why would people turn back to that after being introduced to it?
Tradition. That's what they're used to.
Tradition, what they're used to.
Peer pressure.
Peer pressure. Go for it, Mark.
On the law, there's a real seduction to trusting in it. You know, in it. If everybody just knows the truth, and if everybody just knows what's right and wrong, then everybody will do it, and then we'll have a wonderful society. And that's what we wish for, and we hope for, but we realize there isn't any hope in it, because it doesn't have, there's the person of God that has to be in everybody's life for the spirit of the law has to be followed, not just the letter of the law.
And I'll say this. So in this story right here, or in this letter right here, you have three different people. You have the people of Galatia, then you have Paul, and then you have the Judaizers. Okay? Out of those three, who had lived underneath the old law? Who out of the three had lived underneath the old law? The Judaizers and Paul.
Maybe some of the Galatians.
Maybe some of the Galatians, probably not all of them, right? So the people of Galatia had heard the good news. They had heard the gospel, right? And then now they're going to go from the good news back into something that they weren't even a part of at the start that puts them underneath bondage, right? So they turn back to weak and worthless elementary principles of the world. And we are in Galatians 4, verse 9 right now, for those that just walked in. So, whose slaves you want to be once more. You observe days and months and seasons and years. Why does it say that? Is that necessarily a sin to observe days, months, and years?
Go back to pagan principles of worshiping the elements, the seasons and so forth.
Okay.
Traditions.
Traditions. And that's probably the bigger part that Paul's really going at. You're doing these things as for traditions, right? I've mentioned this several times, that one thing that the early church did was they would celebrate if one of them was killed for being a Christian, right? And they would remember the day that they were killed as being a Christian, right? And so then when it came around the next year, they would be like, you remember, he stood up for the faith and died for the faith. That should encourage all of us to do the same thing, right? That's not a sinful thing. What becomes sinful is when you say you have to do this, otherwise you're not saved, right? It becomes this traditional thing that you do because now you're making a requirement and now you're adding to what God has given you when God did not give you that, right? So it's not a sin to observe days and months and seasons and years. What happens is when you say you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, and that's not at all what God said, right? It's Jesus. It's not Jesus plus plus, right? Like the Hulu commercial that says like plus plus plus, right? It's just Jesus. It's all you need, Jesus, right? So then he says in verse 11, I'm afraid I may have labored over you in vain. Why would Paul be afraid that he labored over them in vain? What has he just done? He just taught them the gospel. Now they've heard the gospel, they've accepted the gospel, and now what have they done? Return back to the old law. So why would Paul be worried that he has labored in vain?
Because they didn't stay with it.
They didn't stay with it. So what was his work? Nothing. Now, Jesus' labor was not in vain by any means. But I think sometimes we can make his labor in vain real quick. How is that so? Because we don't accept it. He did all of this for you and me and everyone else. He went through all of that whole experience, left perfection to come down and die for us, be mocked by his own creation. And then we don't have time for him, or the teaching is too tough, or I have to change this in my life, or whatever it might be, right? And everything that he labored while he was on earth is all in vain because we simply won't give ourselves to him. And the perfect grace and redemption and salvation that he's giving us, because we won't turn to it. There's a lot out there that Jesus did for us if we would just grab hold of it. I think Mark talked about this on last Sunday maybe. But the lady that was bleeding, right? If I can just reach out and touch him, if I can just touch him, I'd be healed. If all of us just had that mindset in our life, all of that sin, all those wounds that we carry, if I can just reach out and touch Jesus, then I'd be healed. Right? That option's out there. It's available. Going into verse 12. Brothers, I entreat you, I plead with you, right? Become as I am. Does that sound a bit prideful for Paul to say, become as I am? Why does he not say become as Christ is?
Because he's like Christ.
Nailed it. Can we say it today to the people we're talking about? Become as I am. Why should someone become as I am? Because I have become as Christ is, because I'm living a Christ-like life, right? Become as I am because I'm chasing after God. It's not that I want you to be me. Please don't be Jacob, right? But I want you to be a Christian, which is being Christ-like, right? Chasing after that. So Paul is saying, follow my example. He says, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. You knew it was because of a bodily element that I preached the gospel to you at first. And he also mentions this in Corinthians. I really want to know what's going on, but they don't give us enough. The Bible, I guess we'll ask that in the final day, I guess. But he doesn't give us enough information exactly about what Paul is dealing with, right? We just know that he's dealing with some kind of element. And we get a little bit of thing about his vision later on. But he's dealing with something, and that's why he preached the gospel to him at first. And then in verse 14 it says, and though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. What's an angel? Why would he say an angel of God? What is an angel? A messenger. You received me as a messenger of God. What was his message? Christ. The gospel of Christ. That's his message, right? A messenger of God as Christ Jesus. So you didn't scorn me. You didn't despise me, which means what did they do? It means they accepted him in, right? And then it goes on to say, he goes in verse 15, says, what then has become of your blessedness? For I testify to you that if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me. Which probably means Paul had a little bit of a vision issue, didn't it? He said, you knew my vision wasn't good, but your love for me was so great when I first came to me that you loved me so much you would have taken out your eye and you'd have given it to me. Anybody here going to do that? I don't know if I'm going to reach into my eye socket and pull up my eye and give it to you, Glenn. Right? But that's what Paul is saying. Paul is saying, you were so grateful when I brought this message to you, this saving message to you, that you would have given me your own eye when I couldn't see. But now you've turned back to this. You've turned back to people that want to build you up for something that's not really building you up for what you want to be built up for. They're promising you X, Y, and Z, but that X, Y, and Z is fading away, right? It's not something that's going to be everlasting in heaven. So what has become of your blessedness? Verse 16, have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth? All right, so what should we do when we give people truth? What manner should we do it in? In love, in grace, right? Now, you can package and wrap truth as gracefully and as loving as possible. What does truth still do? Convicts. And what does Paul say? Paul says, I am sorrowful that I had to, or he said, I am sorry that I had to bring he didn't say sorry. I'm going to lose the verse now. But he was upset that he had to bring a message that brought sorrowfulness to them. But he's thankful that their sorrowness brought what? Brought a change of heart, brought them back to redemption. He said, that message was hard. I know it grieved you, but I'm thankful that the grieving that you had brought you back to redemption, right? Truth is light. What does light do if it's in darkness? Shines on it. What do people not like? When something shines on something that they're not proud of, right? People don't like when a light shines onto something that's dark. Because why is it dark? They want to keep it hidden, right? Don't turn on the light. No. I'm trying to hide this, right? I don't want anybody to see this. And what's the light doing? The light is just, it's like you're on a stage at, something. We were at a banquet, when was it, 3 weeks ago? Anyways, I had to go do the opening prayer, and I got distracted because the lights were so bright. My goodness, you sweat from how bright the lights were, right? That's what that is doing. That's what the message is doing. It is shining right into that darkness, right? So he says, have I now become your enemy by telling you the truth? Do we do that in our life today? Someone becomes an enemy to us because they've done what? Because they've told us truth that we didn't want to hear, but it is true. We get upset because people will tell us the truth, but shouldn't they tell us the truth? Isn't that what we need to know? Does it do any good if we teach everyone false because they like falsehood? Where's that going to get them? First class to a place they don't want to go, right? But then when you give them truth, they get upset because what? Because the truth can be hard sometimes. Because we're not always going to be in accordance to the truth. But if we don't remind each other of the truth, we're never going to grow as a family, right? So, gift wrap it in love and gift wrap it in kindness and grace. But do know that as soon as you do share truth, you can share it in the most genuine and nicest way possible. Some people will still get upset. Still will. Because it's still truth shining in darkness. Then it goes into verse 17. They make much of you, but for no good purpose. Does the world do that? Oh, do they ever? They will hype you up if you get going down the wrong track, and they will build you up. But for what reason? It's not to get you to heaven. It's to get you further and further and further invested into that. And the next thing you know, you turn around, you're not even close to God because you've gotten yourself so invested in all these things of the world, right? The world will build you up, but they're not building you up for heaven. They're building you up for worldly things. So for no good reason. Then it says, they want to shut you out, that you may make much of them. It is always good to be made much of for a good purpose, and not only when I am present with you. Paul says this all the time, in almost every single writing. He will say something along the lines, when I am present with you. We have to be careful that that's not us inside the church building or us around other Christians. You don't act this way because I'm inside the church building, but then as soon as I walk outside the church building, I walk into work on Monday, I'm now this person, right? It ought to be the exact same person, right? It should be the exact same person. And so Paul is saying, don't just chase after this because I'm with you. Don't chase after this because I've just said this to you and you don't want me to be upset with you. Chase after this because Christ died for you. Chase after this because Christ did so much for you. Chase after this because Christ has given you forgiveness if you just accept it. Right? That's why you should chase after it. Don't chase after it because your friends go to that church. Chase after it because of Christ and what Christ has done for you. Right? I also like how in the beginning of verse 18 it says, it is always good to be made much of for a good purpose. How can you be made much of for a good purpose? If you're living for God. You can be made much of for a good purpose, serving the kingdom. Now, is the world going to think that's a good purpose? Not in the slightest. Right? Not in the slightest. So, it is always good to be made much of for a good purpose, and not only when I am present with you. My little children, for whom I again am in anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. I think this is such an interesting analogy. My little children. And he says, I'm in anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. It is just a pain. It's a churning in his stomach, right? Can Christ just be formed in you, right? I mean, it is literally just inside of Paul, just eating him alive, right? Can Christ just be formed in you, right? He is going through the whole labor process, right? Just wanting them to get to the finish line, wanting them to get into a place where they'll accept Christ. And Christ can be formed in them, right? I wish I could be present with you now and change my tone, for I'm perplexed about you. What does Paul think he's doing in his writing then? He knows he's probably being a little bit hard on them, right? He said, I wish I could be there to change my tone, because I'm perplexed. Why would he be perplexed?
Because they're unwillingness to understand the truth.
Yeah. Paul has given them a message that has an infinite amount of wonderfulness, right? Marvelness. Yet they're accepting a message that gives them nothing. Does that make any common sense? It's like someone offered you a $100 bill and you say, no, I'm good. I think I'll take the $1 bill this guy over here is offering me. We would never do that. Why would you do that? Right? But that's what the people in Galatia are doing, right? Because Paul has given them all of this message right here. Yet for some reason they're like, I'm going to take this one over here that does less for me, right? So he's perplexed. Why would you do that? Right? Why is that something you would do? Are we perplexed by people in the world today? Some of the things that people chase after, not even only in the religious world, but just like in general, perplex me. Why would you do that? Why would you chase after that? Why would you put yourself through that, right? It's because they haven't been formed, they haven't had Christ formed in them yet, right? And that's why we have to be more and more of a light in the world. We're going to get to a little bit of 21. All right, let's read. Well, any questions from, or any thoughts between 8 through 20?
Jacob, I think Paul's saying, I wish I could have come and been with you in fellowship and encouragement and just look forward to being here instead of having to come and give you a message of correction and admonishment. Because I did it because I needed to, but I'd rather come and see you as faithful family.
Yeah. And that's a good point. Do we think that in the world today? Boy, I wish when I came to visit you, I would have found you to still be faithful like you were when I left. But instead I came back and I found you what? Unfaithful. So that would be like us talking to someone that was super, super dear to us. They give their life to Christ. We leave, haven't really spoke to them a little bit, then we come back to revisit them, right? And what have we found them? We found them right back to where they were. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? What could Paul not be doing right now? He could not be writing this letter because they were still faithful. And then what would he be writing? He'd be writing a letter like Philippians, all about joy. Keep on straining. He said, your love for me was so great. You were the only church that supported me. Talking about in the book of Philippians, right? But instead, to the churches of Galatia, what's he having to write? Come back to the truth, right? Come back to it because you've left it. Anything else? We're quiet this morning. All right, I'll keep talking. All right, verse 21. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, being children from slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be with you. Then those of the one who has a husband. Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. We'll stop right there for a second. Who are the 2 sons of Abraham that's referred to? Who said it? I heard it somewhere. Who are the 2 sons? Who's the son of slavery? Ishmael? Okay, who's the other one? Isaac, right? Why was Ishmael born that way? How is he a son of slavery?
He was born out of doubt. He never made doubt in his
Born out of doubt, right? God says, I'm going to give you a son at your old age, even though your wife is barren. I'm going to give you a son, right? What did Sarah do? Sarah laughed. Laughed, right? I just cannot even imagine. Sarah laughed, right? Which we'd probably give her a hard time for that. But at the same time, if God were to say that and you're in your upper 90s, I might chuckle a little bit too, because that's kind of far-fetched to believe, right? But with God, what is? Anything is possible, right? If God wants something to happen, God's going to make it happen, right? So, tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? So here Paul is going back at the same thing. You who say you want to be under the law, do you not listen to it? Why can Paul say that? Because he knows it better than them. He says, you're saying all of these things. He's like, this is it. If you would have truly looked at the old law, you would have seen all of these things leading up to who? To Jesus, to Christ. But instead, what are they looking for? They're looking for an earthly kingdom. It's a worldly sense, right? That's not what Christ came to do. Christ came to establish a kingdom that what? It's a heavenly kingdom, right? So, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free one was born through promise. Think about your salvation for a second. What the Judaizers are doing is trying to get them to go to this old covenant to make them born through what? Through the flesh. Because what's the flesh they're wanting them to do? Circumcision, right? Yet here comes Paul giving them the gospel of Christ, which means you're born through what? The promise. Because what has God promised you if you submit to Him? Beautiful inheritance, heaven, the empty mansion waiting for you, right? All of those things. So now you're a son through promise. These women are 2 different covenants, which is what we just talked about, right? One, the one born through slavery is Ishmael. Does anybody know what ended up happening with Ishmael? Hey, y'all. What religion ended up coming from him? Muslim. Islam, right? Isn't that interesting when we try to take things into our own hands instead of letting God just work? It normally doesn't work out that well, does it? We say, but I can do this. I'm smart enough to figure it out, right? And then we take it into our own hands, and we're not letting God's will just work out, right? So 2 covenants, and then Isaac is the son of promise. One is from Mount Sinai, which is, why would it say that? Where was the law given? Right? Being children for slavery, she is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem. Why would Jerusalem be mentioned? Where was the new covenant given? Jerusalem, right? We're going to talk about that a little bit this morning. Christ did all these things 50 days after the grave. What was available? The first gospel sermon. 50 days after you killed my son, says God, here's your chance for salvation. So it corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children, but the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. She's free. Why is she free? Because she's not held to the bondage that is the what? The old law, right? Not held to all those things anymore, because why? Because Christ has broken all those chains and has given you a new way, right? Has given you a better way. Has given us freedom, right? We're no longer bound to the world because we're now set free. So she is our mother, for it is written, rejoice, which is the whole book of Philippians. Rejoice. Where does Paul write most of his things from? Prison. Yeah, what does he talk about in Philippians all the time? Rejoice. Be happy. Be so joyful. And he's saying that from where? A prison cell. Rejoice. Why should we rejoice? Because God is great, right? Happiness can fluctuate. Joy should never change. We should always have joy because of what Christ has done for us, right? Our happiness on earth may go up and down because we could have sad moments. But in those sad moments, we should still have what? We should still have joy because of what Christ has promised us at the end, right? There's 2 ways to look at it. Our joy and happiness are not the same thing. So rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud. Break free from the chains that you're under and cry out to the Father. You who are not in labor, for the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband. Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. How do we become children of promise? Obey the gospel, right? So we're not adding all these other things, right? You're not going to become the child of promise if you're going back to the Old Testament, if you're going back to circumcision, if you're going back to all those things, right? That's not how you become a child of promise. That's how you become a child of what? Of the flesh. The flesh ain't going to save you, right? Anybody here body deteriorating a little bit every day or year or month, whatever it might be, right? Things hurt a little bit more every day, it seems like, right? Because the flesh, it's all wasting away. What's not wasting away? The everlasting that He's promised you, right? The world can take every single thing away from you, but they cannot take away the salvation that God has promised you. They can't take it away from you. It's still available. It's right there. You just have to take it. But just as at the time He was born according to the flesh, persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so as it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. Cast him out. Because why? Because the one that's still stuck in slavery will not inherit what? The same as the person that's of promise. Right? Two things there. So what do we need to be a child of? Free. Freedom. Who doesn't like freedom? Love freedom, right? Does anybody want to be locked in a prison cell with just anything you can do? You can't do anything, right? You're just stuck there. Don't have anything. Anybody want to do that? That's what we do to ourselves whenever we put ourselves underneath the world, right? I'll finish this off, Mark. Hey, Patsy.
I was just thinking of another biblical analogy to this is that, God delivered Israel out from under the bondage of Egypt before He gave them the law to be obedient. He delivered them first, and that's what we've been delivered from through Jesus Christ, from sin. But at the same time, He gives us forgiveness. And before, those two things were kind of separated and not in the same moment. But Jesus delivers us from the law because He completes it and fulfills it. And then it dies because the world kills it. And then we are given the Spirit and life and eternal life.
And that's one thing that I think the Jews were realistically missing what you just mentioned. We'll end on this, but he had rescued them greatly prior to this. Yet they're not clinging to when they were rescued before the law. They were clinging to the law that was going to save them. Right? There's much more than that, right? We cannot make things a legal system. We have to allow Jesus to do what Jesus does best, which is be our rescuer. We'll end on that. Y'all please move forward as well.